Okay, so in this video, we are going to look at the Atkinson-Shiffrin information processing model. So this is one of the main models of memory. It is the one that has been the most accepted over the past several decades. And basically, the information processing model assumes that the processing of information for memory storage occurs in a series of three stages. Or in other words, it sees memory as this flow of information that goes through a series of stages. And in each of these stages, there is a different type of storage. So we'll very briefly go through these right now, and then on the following slides, I'm going to go through each one in a bit more detail. So first of all, we have sensory memory. This is the storage of brief sensory events. So things such as sights, sounds, tastes, that we hold on to for a very short amount of time, the memory of that. So this is the first step of processing stimuli from the environment. If the information is not important, it gets discarded. We just have that memory for a really very short amount of time and then we lose it. But if it is important, if it is valuable, then we pay attention to it, then it moves into our short-term memory. So our short-term memory is again a temporary storage system that processes that incoming sensory memory. So this lasts about 20 to 30 seconds. And again, if it's important, it gets transferred, so it'll go into long-term memory. And if it's not important or we're not paying enough attention to it, then that information gets lost. You will see that above short-term memory here, it says rehearsal. This is something we'll talk about in more detail when we get to the slide on short-term memory. But what's happening here, so between short-term memory and long-term memory, this is where memory consolidation is happening. So the transfer of short-term memories to long-term memory. And as far as we know, there is unlimited capacity for long-term memory, and we can hold information for indefinite periods of time. So we'll look a little bit more at that in a minute. You'll also notice that there's an arrow going back. When we retrieve those long-term memories, they are then put back into our short-term memory for that period of time. So moving on to sensory memory in a bit more detail. If you pay attention to everything being absorbed by your senses right now, there's a lot. Maybe you're aware of the temperature in the room, the amount of light, the different sounds, the feelings that are going on in your body, the feeling of sitting in the chair or wherever you're sitting. Even if you're not paying attention to those things, your senses are constantly absorbing all of that information, and that information is then being processed by our sensory memory. So I want you to just make sure you're looking at the screen. Okay, now if I was to ask you if you could tell me what those letters were, you could probably tell me some of them. You all saw them and your sensory memory processed the screen, but they weren't there long enough for you to really process them enough to store them. So you can only actually remember whatever is stored in your sensory memory. It wasn't long enough to transfer that into short-term memory. So this type of memory is called iconic memory. It's a very short visual impression. Because you saw that for a split second, that was long enough for you to have this visual impression. If I did not ask you to think about what you saw and I waited until the end of this video and then said think about what you saw on that slide, by that point that sensory memory will have disappeared. So you would have a much harder time telling me what you saw. Now, iconic memories are very, very brief visual impressions that fade very quickly. Different books say different things, but realistically only a couple of seconds. Some say even less than that. The capacity, however, is very large. We can hold everything that we can see at one time in our sensory memory. It just doesn't last very long because all of that information will very quickly be pushed out by the new visual information that we are receiving. Now, you may have heard of photographic memory, which the technical term for this is eidetic imagery. It is not quite what you see in the movies. In the movies, they make it seem like this is a photographic memory for long-term memory, but really it's just for these iconic memories. So whereas for most of us that information fades away within a couple of seconds, eidetic imagery is the ability to access a visual memory for 30 seconds or more. So it might be that that person can only actually remember it for 30 seconds after, but that's still considered photographic memory because that's much longer than the majority of people are able to hold an iconic memory. So not quite the way it seems in the movies. Now, let's say you are walking down the street and someone passes you in a red t-shirt. And if I asked you straight away, what color t-shirt was the person wearing that you just walked by, you could probably say red, even though you weren't focusing on it, because for a very short amount of time, it's still in your sensory memory. You still have that visual impression. Even though you may not have even directly looked at it, you've still absorbed that information. And it's being held in your sensory memory for that very short amount of time. Now, if I was to wait and ask you maybe 10 minutes later, what color t-shirt was the person wearing that you walked by 10 minutes ago, then you're not going to be able to tell me, most likely, because at that point, that iconic memory has disappeared. However, what if the person walking by was extremely, extremely good looking, and so you do pay a little bit more attention, you do look at them in more detail, or for a few seconds longer? In this situation, you are processing the information on a slightly deeper level, and so the image of that red t-shirt will be stored into your short-term memory. So if the information is important or we pay attention to it, that is when that gets transferred into short-term memory. If it's not important, we forget it. So iconic memory is specifically for visual information, but we then have echoic memory for auditory information. So this is regarding sound. If you were to hear a really loud sound right now and I asked you to recall what it sounded like a few seconds later, that copy of the sound that you're recalling is an echoic memory. Okay, this actually usually lasts a little longer than an iconic memory, so between 1 to 10 seconds. But after that, the memory becomes weaker and weaker until you can no longer recall it. The capacity is much smaller, however, even though the duration is longer. The capacity is shorter because if you think about it, with visual information, you can see a lot of different things at once. We can only hear so many things at once because those sounds will overlap. So your capacity for echoic memory is a little bit smaller. So once information has entered our sensory memory, as I mentioned, if it has some kind of meaning or we pay attention to it, it then enters our short-term memory. So as I mentioned before, the duration for short-term memory is only about 20 to 30 seconds. However, there are ways that we can keep information in short-term memory for longer, and one of the main ways is using maintenance rehearsal. So if you remember back to this, I mentioned, you see this rehearsal here, I mentioned we'd come back to that. So maintenance rehearsal is when we keep repeating something in our minds in order to hold it in our short-term memory. This is something I'm sure all of you have used before. So if someone has ever told you a phone number or an address or something, and it's before you've had a chance to open up your phone and write it down, then what you might do is keep saying it over and over in your head until you get a chance to write that down. If you've done that before, you've used maintenance rehearsal. You're repeating something over and over in your head until you need to use that information, until you're able to write it down or use it in whichever way. However, as much as maintenance rehearsal can help, our short-term memory still does have a limited capacity, and that capacity is usually 7 items plus or minus 2. Okay, that means 5 to 9 items. Okay, I don't know why it's always referred to as 7 plus or minus 2, but it is. And this is known as Miller's magical number because that is the psychologist that discovered that this is the average amount of information that people can hold in their short-term memory. And obviously it varies. This is just on average, most people can hold 5 to 9 items. Some people have a great memory and can hold much more than that. Some people, maybe as people get older and they experience more cognitive decline, their capacity may be much lower. It could also depend on the current state that you're in. Maybe you're really tired. Maybe you're not. Maybe you're having a hard time focusing. The amount that you'll remember will be less. But on average, this is the amount that can be held in short-term memory. There are, however, ways that we can increase the amount that we can hold in short-term memory. And so one way that we can do that is through chunking. So remember that I said most people have a memory capacity of 5 to 9 items, not numbers. Items doesn't have to mean individual numbers. We can group numbers into one item. So for example, in class, what I would usually do is show you this, give you a minute to memorize it, and then you would see how much you could remember. Then I would do a different version. And the chances are that you would find this version much easier. You would be able to remember many more of these numbers within a minute than you would these, because they are chunked. They are grouped into 4 chunks of numbers. So this is something that, again, you will have all seen in your daily lives. Phone numbers are chunked. So social security numbers, passport numbers, credit card numbers, they are all chunked into these different little chunks of numbers, which makes it much easier for you to remember because you're able to hold more in your short-term memory. Then the last thing to talk about with short-term memory is working memory. This is a concept that many models of short-term memory include, and it refers to what is actually going on in your short-term memory. So short-term memory is referring to the type of memory, but working memory is referring to what's actually going on in order to temporarily store that information. And it's also referring primarily to the ability to maintain and manipulate information while it's in short-term memory. So to give you an example of what I mean by that, most IQ tests will assess a person's working memory, not their short-term, they're specifically looking at working memory. And usually that will be in the form of some kind of math question. And you're not allowed to write anything down. So you're given a math question, and not only do you have to keep that information in your mind, you have to then manipulate it to try to get the answer. So all of that is going on in your short-term memory. So once information is in our short-term memory, it can then either fade away, or again, if it's important, we pay attention to it, it can be transferred into our long-term memory. So long-term memory, again, as I mentioned, has unlimited capacity as far as we know, and it's thought of as being made up of 2 main types, which are explicit and implicit memory. So explicit memory is also called declarative memory. And this includes memories of facts and events that we can consciously remember and we can recall, or we can declare, hence the name declarative memory. We can say it out loud. We can tell you about, you can tell someone about that memory. So this includes semantic memories, so general facts, knowledge about words, concepts, language. If I ask you who are the last 5 presidents, if you can tell me that, that's part of your semantic memory. Episodic memories are sometimes called autobiographical memories because they are memories of your personal experiences, information about, the events that we have personally experienced, the who, what, where, when of an event. So if I asked you to tell me about your 10th birthday party, that is an episodic memory. Implicit memories are then memories that are not part of our consciousness. They are formed through behaviors. So this includes procedural memories. So this is a type of memory that stores information about how to do things. So your skills that you have, the different actions you engage in, your knowledge of how to do that is an implicit memory. So for example, how to ride a bike, how to tie your shoelaces, how to drive. Every time you stop to do those activities, you don't have to recall the exact memory of when you learned how to do that. It's now an implicit memory. You don't need to think about it. It's kind of like muscle memory. Okay, it's one way to think about that. You just, over time, through engaging in those behaviors, you have a memory of how to do those things. And this also includes behaviors that have been learned through emotional conditioning. So, for example, one of the examples I gave in the learning chapter was being conditioned to fear something. So maybe you have a fear of spiders, but you don't consciously remember why or what occurred to condition that fear. But through some form of experience, you have been conditioned to fear this. And when you see a spider, again, you're not thinking about this explicit memory of what happened. It's this implicit memory that elicits that fear. Or the other example I believe I used was if you have certain songs that you associate with certain experiences or that elicits a certain emotion, again, that's an implicit memory. That is not something you consciously think about, but every time you hear that song, it brings out that emotion. Okay. So one other type of long-term memory that you should be aware of is called flashbulb memories. So these are enduring memories of emotionally charged events that seem permanently seared into the brain. So it's a record of an atypical or an unusual event that has very strong emotional associations. So it's caused by stressful, emotionally arousing, personal, or historical events. Quite often, flashbulb memories are things that we specifically have experienced and we remember, but it can be a big historical event as well. So, for example, most people can remember where they were when they first heard about the 9/11 terrorist attacks. I was 10 at the time, I think, and I mean, I was in England. I was I was 5 hours away, and yeah, I still remember coming home from school. So obviously, it was the afternoon in England when we found out about this. I remember coming home from school and seeing it on the TV, and I have a very strong memory of that. And that wasn't something I even personally experienced, but I was aware of just how emotional this was and how big this was in history, and that was enough for me to permanently sear that memory. It doesn't necessarily need to be negative emotional memories. It could be overly happy memories. I suppose, my memory of being proposed to would be a flashbulb memory because I have a very strong memory of that because it was such a happy moment. It could be things like I know my mum remembers where she was when she found out Elvis Presley died. So the point is they're very long-term memories that are connected to an emotionally charged event. So if you want to hear about some other examples of flashbulb memories, there is a video I've included, and you can hear some people talk about their different versions of flashbulb memories.